Nothing beats an ambush, and I know that.
What happens when one of the most powerful men in the music industry stands trial for some of the darkest crimes imaginable, yet walks away free? Sean Diddy Combs, a billionaire mogul who shaped hip-hop culture for decades, was found not guilty of leading a criminal enterprise, not guilty of racketeering, not guilty of trafficking conspiracy. The verdict shocked millions around the world, not because the courtroom cleared him, but because of the mountain of disturbing allegations that led to this trial in the first place. In the eyes of the justice system, Diddy walked away a free man. But in the court of public opinion, the story is far from over.
I have proved things that I can say that will back up my claim, but this is not for the world to know about.
How does someone accused of so much, with so many witnesses and such serious claims, simply walk away untouched? The case of Diddy is more than just a scandal in Hollywood. It's a mirror reflecting how deeply broken our justice system can be when money, influence, and celebrity status collide.
Out there that sold as many records as we did. We outsold Bad Boy, LaFace, every black record label.
And a legal system that too often bends for the wealthy while leaving victims in the shadows. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the Diddy case. From explosive lawsuits and federal raids to a verdict that left the world divided, we'll explore why this trial has become one of the most controversial legal battles in modern celebrity history. We'll uncover the voices of the accusers, the defense strategies that dismantled their claims, and the uncomfortable truth about how justice works, or doesn't work, when the defendant is a global superstar. To understand why the public was so outraged by Diddy's not guilty verdict, we need to revisit the allegations that put him under the microscope in the first place. It all began when singer Cassie Ventura, Diddy's former partner, filed a bombshell lawsuit in late 2023. Her story was disturbing: years of control, manipulation, and abuse behind closed doors. She alleged that Diddy forced her into situations against her will, orchestrated encounters with other men, and used violence as a tool of power. Within just 24 hours, the case was settled, but not before it cracked open a door that would never fully close again. Cassie's lawsuit emboldened others. Soon, more women began to step forward, filing suits of their own. They painted a chillingly consistent picture: coercion, trafficking, physical assault, and threats designed to keep them silent. Some spoke of parties where drugs flowed freely, where women were treated as disposable, and where Diddy's word was law. These weren't just rumors whispered in the tabloids, these were sworn legal filings backed by harrowing testimony. Then came the moment that shook the industry: federal raids on Diddy's homes in Los Angeles and Miami. Heavily armed agents stormed his properties, seizing electronic devices, documents, and anything that might hold evidence. Images of those raids spread across the internet in real time. For the first time, the public saw Diddy not as an untouchable mogul, but as a man cornered by the law. But it didn't stop there. Allegations expanded into claims of a criminal enterprise, an organized network where money, influence, and fear allegedly kept victims in line. Prosecutors hinted at connections to trafficking, financial crimes, and even violent acts that had long been whispered about in the music world but never proven in court. Media coverage didn't just grow, it exploded like wildfire. Every outlet wanted a piece of the story. Nightly news segments ran in primetime, documentaries were fast-tracked into production, and investigative podcasts dissected timelines, testimonies, and rumors with the precision of crime reporters. Social media turned into a courtroom of its own. Twitter threads went viral, each one laying out intricate timelines, connecting dots, and resurfacing decades-old interviews that suddenly took on new meaning. Instagram Reels and TikTok clips replayed Cassie's lawsuit line by line, spliced with footage of federal raids and flashing images of Diddy smiling on red carpets. The contrast was haunting. For many observers, the pattern was undeniable. Too many women with eerily similar stories, too many allegations that aligned almost perfectly, too much smoke to dismiss the possibility of a raging fire beneath the surface. The public began asking, if this isn't enough to bring someone down, what would be? And yet, as shocking, detailed, and widespread as these accusations were, they were only the prologue to the true legal drama. Because once the case stepped out of the world of media speculation and entered the courtroom, everything shifted. Narratives that seemed airtight in podcasts and online debates suddenly had to withstand the rigid scrutiny of the justice system. This was where the carefully built image of Diddy as an abuser and alleged trafficker would face its ultimate trial, against a defense team armed not only with strategy and influence, but with a near-limitless supply of money. When the trial finally began, it wasn't just another celebrity case. It became an international spectacle. The courthouse transformed into a stage, with cameras positioned outside every morning to capture Diddy's arrival, flanked by high-powered attorneys in tailored suits. Crowds gathered daily, some chanting for justice, others just wanting a glimpse of the man at the center of it all. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, electric. For years, whispers of Diddy's misconduct had swirled through the music industry, whispered in dressing rooms, studios, and after parties. But now, for the first time, those whispers were given a microphone in the form of sworn testimony. This was the moment where explosive lawsuits and scandalous rumors would either solidify into undeniable truth or crumble under the harsh spotlight of cross-examination. The stakes weren't just Diddy's reputation, they were about whether the justice system itself could hold someone so rich, so powerful, accountable. Prosecutors opened with a narrative that sounded like something out of a Hollywood crime thriller. They argued that Diddy wasn't merely a businessman, not simply a chart-topping music mogul, but the architect of a sprawling criminal enterprise hidden behind the mask of fame. They spoke of a man who weaponized his wealth, who built an ecosystem where fear and silence were the currency, and where exploitation was not an accident but a system. The charges laid out weren't small. They included sexual assault, human trafficking, intimidation, racketeering, and decades of alleged abuse of power. Witnesses began to take the stand, and their testimonies were vivid and chilling. Some described so-called parties that seemed less like celebrations and more like carefully orchestrated rituals of domination. They painted scenes of rooms with blackout curtains, of music thundering so loud it drowned out protests, of environments where drugs flowed freely but where refusal wasn't really an option. Several recalled having their phones confiscated before entering, stripped of their ability to call for help or record what happened. Others said they were pressured into acts they didn't consent to, terrified of the consequences if they resisted. The message was always the same: in Diddy's world, his word was law. To the outside world, Diddy's empire gleamed with glamour, power, and unstoppable influence. He was the man who had defined hip-hop culture, who had built businesses spanning fashion, alcohol, and entertainment. But prosecutors insisted that beneath the shine was something far darker, a house of horrors hidden in plain sight, propped up by fear and silence. And yet, as gripping and horrific as the prosecution story was, cracks began to show almost immediately. Diddy hadn't entered this battle unprepared. He had walked into the courthouse shielded by one of the most formidable defenses money could assemble. His lawyers weren't just skilled, they were elite. Veterans of high-profile cases, masters of dismantling witness credibility, experts at twisting narratives until reasonable doubt was the only thing left standing. From the very first cross-examinations, they went to work. Every timeline was dissected, every inconsistency magnified, every accuser's motive questioned. They leaned heavily into the idea that settlements and lawsuits weren't proof of guilt but signs of opportunism. Slowly, they began to chip away at what once seemed like a tidal wave of accusations, transforming it, at least in the eyes of the jury, into a patchwork of questionable testim. They zeroed in on every inconsistency, every crack in the prosecution's case, no matter how small. Diddy's defense attorneys didn't just challenge the accuser's words, they dismantled them piece by piece. Timelines were scrutinized until even the most minor discrepancy seemed monumental. If an accuser said one date in an interview and another in testimony, it was treated as if the entire story was unreliable. If memories didn't align perfectly with records, the defense leaned into it, hammering home the idea that trauma had blurred truth, or worse, that the stories had been fabricated altogether. One by one, motives were questioned. Why come forward now? Why wait years? Why accept settlements if justice was the true goal? The defense made sure the jury was constantly reminded that many of these lawsuits had ended not in convictions, but in financial payouts, often in the millions. To Diddy's lawyers, this was the ultimate evidence of opportunism. The accusers, they claimed, weren't seeking accountability, they were seeking profit. And so, every witness who took the stand was subjected to brutal, drawn-out cross-examinations that sometimes lasted hours, other times stretched over days. Jurors watched as tears, trembling voices, and raw emotion met the cold, calculated precision of attorneys trained to shred credibility. Each question was a scalpel, cutting away at the strength of testimony until stories that once felt unshakable began to appear fractured, fragile, even unreliable. Slowly but surely, what had begun as a chorus of accusations started to sound, in the courtroom at least, like a series of disconnected, questionable claims. The prosecution's case faltered in another devastating way: evidence. The public had been bracing for bombshells, the kind of evidence that would obliterate doubt. They expected damning text messages, secret recordings, videos, or documents that would make conviction inevitable. But when it mattered most, those smoking guns never arrived in the way people imagined. Some of the most hyped-up materials seized during the federal raids, devices, files, recordings, were ultimately ruled inadmissible. Procedural issues about how they were collected barred them from the trial. Other pieces, once rumored to be devastating, appeared flimsy when put under the microscope of courtroom scrutiny. And then there were the witnesses who never came. The insiders the media had breathlessly speculated about, the ones who were said to have the power to blow the entire case wide open, never took the stand. Some were unwilling, too afraid to face cross-examination. Others were silenced by legal entanglements, non-disclosure agreements, unresolved lawsuits, or plea deals that legally prevented them from testifying. Each absence left another hole in the prosecution's narrative. The defense capitalized on these gaps relentlessly. They argued that if the government truly had a case, it would have presented evidence too overwhelming to ignore. Instead, what they had, the defense claimed, was speculation dressed up as truth. They urged the jury to see the bigger picture not as a pattern of abuse but as a feeding frenzy, a rush of opportunists drawn to a powerful man like sharks to blood in the water. In their framing, Diddy wasn't a monster, wasn't a criminal mastermind orchestrating abuse from behind the curtains. He was the target, a victim of greed, envy, and a sensationalist media machine determined to tear him down. They said fame had made him a magnet for false claims, that his wealth had made him a target for lawsuits, and that his name had been dragged through the mud not by justice, but by character assassination. The trial, at its core, became a tug-of-war between two competing narratives. On one side, the prosecution presented a chilling vision of a powerful man hiding a dark truth, surrounded by silence and fear. On the other, the defense insisted this was all smoke and mirrors, built on speculation, gossip, and hysteria rather than hard evidence. By the time closing arguments arrived, the tension inside the courtroom was suffocating. Jurors leaned forward, pens in hand, every word landing with weight. Prosecutors pleaded with them to see what was right in front of their eyes, a pattern of abuse too consistent, too chilling, to dismiss as coincidence. They argued that even without perfect evidence, the collective weight of testimony and circumstance revealed the truth, that justice required courage, not perfection. The defense thundered back, reminding the jury of the cornerstone of American justice, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They insisted that no matter how compelling a story might sound, no man should be condemned on speculation. They framed the prosecution's case as one built on outrage rather than fact, whispers rather than proof. Then, at last, the verdict came. Not guilty. On every major count. The words rippled through the courtroom like an earthquake. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Some clutched their heads in disbelief. Others whispered prayers under their breath. For Diddy and his team, it was triumph. His attorneys embraced, grinning, celebrating a victory they claimed was not just his, but a victory for the very principle of justice. But outside those walls, the reaction was far different. For survivors, advocates, and much of the public, the verdict felt like a gut punch up, a bitter confirmation that wealth and power could still bend the scales of justice. How, they asked, could so many voices, so many consistent allegations, so much testimony, result in complete absolution? Was this truly the justice system working as intended, or was it proof that power always protects itself? The streets outside the courthouse filled with protesters holding signs, "Justice for victims, money buys freedom, believe survivors." Online, hashtags erupted in anger and disbelief, trending worldwide within minutes, #Justice for Cassie, #Diddy verdict, #protect victims. News outlets went into overdrive, panels of experts dissecting the trial late into the night, anchors asking pointed questions the jury didn't answer. Was this the truth? Or simply a masterclass in the power of influence, wealth, and strategy? The moment was explosive. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave, the weight of disbelief hanging heavy in the air. For a few seconds, it was as if time stood still. Then, Diddy's legal team erupted in jubilation. Attorneys hugged one another, their smiles wide, their relief palpable. To them, this was not just a victory, it was the vindication of a client they argued had been vilified by the media. They shook Diddy's hand, clapped him on the back, and framed the outcome as the ultimate triumph of truth over hysteria, of evidence over speculation. But beyond those courtroom walls, the mood was starkly different. For countless survivors, advocates, and everyday members of the public, the verdict felt like a crushing blow, another chapter in the long, painful story of how money and power can tilt the scales of justice. How, they asked in outrage, could so many voices, so many overlapping allegations, so many stories that sounded so tragically alike, all lead to absolute freedom? To them, the verdict was not proof of innocence. It was proof of the system's failure. Outside the courthouse, anger spilled into the streets. Protesters who had been waiting for hours surged forward, their signs raised high: "Justice for victims, money buys freedom, believe survivors." Their chants cut through the noise of reporters and camera shutters, echoing against the courthouse steps. Some wept openly, clutching placards as though holding on to the last shred of hope that someone, somewhere, would still listen. On social media, outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, hashtags like #JusticeForCassie, #ProtectVictims, #DiddyVerdict were trending worldwide, drawing millions of posts. Survivors of abuse across the globe spoke out, warning that the verdict would have chilling consequences. "This is why we don't come forward," one woman wrote in a viral thread. "If Diddy can walk away after this, what chance do the rest of us have?" The sentiment spread like wildfire, amplifying the fear that the decision would discourage others from speaking out against powerful men. Journalists wasted no time weighing in. Reporters who had been following the case for months, some even embedded in the day-to-day grind of the courthouse, described the verdict as a devastating blow to victims' rights. Major newspapers ran blistering editorials, questioning how allegations this severe could fail to hold up under scrutiny. One editorial asked bluntly, "What message does this send? That if you have enough money, you're untouchable." On cable news, panels of legal experts dissected the trial minute by minute, pointing out how critical evidence was ruled inadmissible and how the defense's strategy had preyed on inconsistencies rather than addressing the larger, chilling pattern. Analysts took an even broader view, reminding audiences that this wasn't the first time the justice system had stumbled when confronted with celebrity power. Comparisons were drawn to past trials involving figures like Harvey Weinstein, R. Kelly, and even O.J. Simpson. Once again, they argued, the public's perception of guilt seemed miles apart from the courtroom's final judgment. When the accused is wealthy and famous, one commentator noted, acquittal isn't surprising, it's expected. Celebrities, too, couldn't stay silent, though their responses revealed just how divided the industry was. Some artists and actors used their platforms to defend the accusers, reminding fans that *not guilty does not mean *innocent. One actress wrote on Instagram, "The system failed. Again. My heart breaks for every survivor watching this." Her post racked up millions of likes in hours. Others, however, chose silence, a silence many interpreted as either fear of retaliation or the desire to protect business connections. After all, Diddy wasn't just an artist, he was a brand, an empire, with ties that stretched across music, fashion, television, and nightlife. Speaking out could mean cutting ties with one of the most influential figures in entertainment. Still, a handful of celebrities went against the grain, publicly congratulating Diddy and framing the verdict as proof that he had been unfairly targeted. But these comments only ignited more backlash online, as critics accused them of valuing loyalty and profit over accountability and justice. The divide was crystal clear. Inside the courtroom, it was celebration. Outside, it was fury, heartbreak, and disbelief. Across the world, one haunting question lingered louder than any verdict could silence: was this justice, or was it power, once again, protecting itself? For Diddy himself, the aftermath of the trial was anything but simple. On paper, he was a free man. Legally, the system had spoken, not guilty. But the court of public opinion was far harsher. His reputation, once polished to a shine by decades of success in music, fashion, and business, was now clouded with suspicion. Even as his legal team celebrated the verdict, the outside world began to shift. Endorsement deals quietly dissolved. Sponsors and collaborators who once flaunted their association with him began to pull back. Corporate partners released vague statements about reviewing partnerships or aligning with values, code for distancing themselves from controversy without directly condemning him. Some streaming platforms kept his catalog intact, but the cultural narrative surrounding him had changed forever. To many, he was no longer the untouchable mogul who had conquered both hip-hop and mainstream business. Instead, he was the man who had walked out of court, but not entirely free. Free legally, yes, but chained reputationally to the stigma of accusations that would never fully disappear. And then there were the accusers, the women and men who had stepped forward despite enormous risks. Though they had technically lost in the courtroom, many refused to accept silence as the final outcome. Some vowed to continue their fight through civil litigation, knowing that the burden of proof in civil court is different, less crushing than beyond a reasonable doubt. Others gave emotional interviews, often through tears, expressing both anger and heartbreak at the system they felt had abandoned them. Their voices filled podcasts, talk shows, and documentaries, ensuring that, while they may have lost in court, their stories continued to shape the public narrative. They spoke not just for themselves, but for the countless others who had never dared to speak up, using their platforms to warn the world that their struggle was far from over. The Diddy case, therefore, didn't simply conclude with a verdict, it detonated a cultural firestorm. Within days, conversations about celebrity privilege, gender dynamics, and the balance of power in America dominated media landscapes. Talk shows debated it nightly. Podcasts dissected trial transcripts line by line. YouTube commentary channels uploaded breakdowns of testimony, pointing out contradictions and asking why certain evidence never surfaced. TikTok was flooded with survivors sharing their own stories, inspired by the trial but haunted by its outcome. For millions, the case wasn't just about Sean Combs. It was about the deeper, systemic flaws that seemed to repeat themselves in high-profile trials, the belief that when the accused is rich, famous, and connected, the system bends. For legal experts, the verdict reignited an age-old debate that sits at the very heart of American law. Does the justice system deliver true justice, or does it deliver outcomes dictated by resources and influence? Prosecutors, despite months of preparation, struggled against a defense team that used every procedural tool, every loophole, every legal weapon available to dismantle their case. Critics pointed out that this was the perfect illustration of how the system is stacked against victims of abuse, trafficking, and coercion, crimes notoriously difficult to prove with physical evidence. In cases like these, testimony becomes the primary weapon, but testimony alone rarely survives against the high-powered machinery of elite defense lawyers. The trial, in effect, laid bare a grim reality: the truth can exist, and still not be enough. For advocacy groups and survivors, the verdict was more than disappointing, it was devastating. Many said the decision had the potential to silence other victims from ever coming forward. If allegations backed by multiple voices, years of whispers, and massive federal raids could all evaporate into a not guilty verdict, then what chance does an ordinary person have against their abuser? The verdict, they argued, didn't just free one man, it sent a chilling message across the nation: if your abuser is powerful enough, speaking up may cost you everything and change nothing. And yet, for others, the case became a rallying point. Activists organized marches. Advocacy organizations used the spotlight to push for reforms, from how evidence is admitted in abuse cases to how survivors are supported during lengthy trials. For them, the Diddy case wasn't an ending, but a beginning, a chance to pressure lawmakers, the legal system, and even the entertainment industry to take a harder stance against abuse and exploitation. For the public, however, the trial acted as a mirror, reflecting back uncomfortable questions. How much faith do we really have in the justice system? Are wealthy celebrities truly playing by the same rules as everyone else? Or are we watching a system that quietly fractures when placed under the weight of money and fame? In living rooms, online forums, and community spaces, people debated whether justice was served or if justice itself had been revealed as an illusion. As months passed, the Diddy case stopped being just a headline and became a reference point. Commentators drew comparisons to other high-profile acquittals, from Hollywood moguls to political figures, each case reinforcing the perception that influence shields the powerful. Some even noted the broader cultural impact, young people questioning whether the legal system could ever be trusted, and educators using the trial as a teaching moment about power, privilege, and the fragility of truth in courtrooms. But there was another side, one equally vocal. Supporters of the verdict argued that the system had worked exactly as it was designed. They reminded the public that the burden of proof is not a suggestion, it is the bedrock of justice. Without irrefutable evidence, they insisted, no one should lose their freedom. To them, not guilty was not a flaw, but a victory for fairness, a reminder that allegations, no matter how many, no matter how loud, cannot replace proof. They saw the verdict not as corruption, but as protection against a world where accusation alone could destroy lives. This leaves the Diddy case in a paradoxical space. On one hand, it exposed the deep flaws in how the system handles cases of abuse and power. On the other, it reinforced the principle that the state must always carry the highest burden of proof. Justice, morality, and legality collided in the courtroom, leaving behind no clear resolution, only questions that may never be fully answered. As the dust continues to settle, one truth remains undeniable: the Diddy case will not be forgotten. It has already reshaped conversations about celebrity, corruption, accountability, and the very definition of justice in America. It will be studied in law schools, revisited in documentaries, and dissected in newsrooms for years to come. Because at its core, this case was never just about Sean Combs. It was about the uncomfortable, lingering question it leaves behind: what does justice really mean when power is part of the equation?